This video demonstrates the use of multiple vectors in a program. This program we're going to write helps college students make the decision of what major to pursue. The program is going to output a list of majors that meet two criteria. One is the minimum average wage for a major, and the other is the maximum unemployment rate. So if a major meets both of these criteria of what the user enters, then we'll output that major as a candidate. Okay, so we're going to consider 16 majors, and so we'll make the number of majors a constant, and we'll make that 16. Since we have three pieces of data, majors, average wage, and unemployment rate, we're going to create three vectors. One for the majors, which is going to be a vector of strings, and the size of that vector will be the number of majors. The second will be a vector for the average wage, which will be an integer. And again, it will have the size of the number of majors we're considering. And finally, the third vector will be the unemployment rate, which will make a double. And once again, it'll be the same size as the number of majors. So at the first location of each of the vectors, so location 0 for that vector of majors, we're going to have engineering. And at the first location of the wage vector, we're going to have the wage for engineering, which is 55,000. And the first location of the unemployment will also be engineering's unemployment rate, which is 7.5%. At the second location of each major, we will add agriculture. And the wage at the second location will be agriculture's average wage of 32,000. And at the second location of the unemployment, we will have the unemployment for agriculture, which is 7%. Now, one observation is that I'm going to have to do a lot of typing in of this data. And so what I'd like to be able to do is to easily be able to just copy and paste so that I can add in the next 14 items. And so one way for me to make that easier on myself is I'm going to create an index variable, initialize it to 0, and I'm going to use the index variable to replace the integer literal used for the index values. And then at the end of a given major's input, I'm going to increment that index. And I'll do that again for agriculture. And then I'll increment the index. This is the exact same meaning as what we had previously. So since I starts at 0, all of the engineering information will go into the first location of each vector. And then we increment I, so I becomes 1. And in the next group, we have the agriculture major and the wage and unemployment, which is all going into the second location of each vector. And now I can simply copy and paste, and I have a template from which I can produce the other 16 majors from. So I'm going to pause the video and add the rest of these in and get back to you in just a moment. I've entered in the other 14 majors with their respective wage and unemployment using the exact same pattern for each, which made it pretty quick. So let's go ahead and compile the program and see how we're doing so far. Compiles just fine, and it runs without any runtime errors. Now we haven't output anything yet, so let's go ahead and give a try. So we'll just say, what's the third major? Actually, this is going to be the fourth major because it's at index location 3. Compile, and we'll output architecture. Architecture is that the fourth. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, so architecture is the fourth. So that's good. So what we need to do now is ask the user for an acceptable wage. We'll store that user entered acceptable wage in a variable called user wage, and let's do that with a cin. So user wage, and let's make sure everything's working fine. Acceptable wage, I'll say 30,000. Okay. Now using that entered wage, we can go ahead and get the first step of this program working, which is output all the majors that have at least the user entered wage. So what we'll need to do is create a for loop. And we'll go from I equal to 0 to I less than the number of majors. And we increment the I. I'm going to make sure I actually have correctly spelled number of majors. Number of majors, good. And what we'll be doing is we'll look at the wage of each major and make sure it's large enough. So let's start by outputting each of the wages on a new line. So I'll say 30,000. And we're just simply outputting the wages. Now we just want to output the wages that at least meet this value of the user value. So if the current wage is greater than or equal to the user wage, then let's output that wage. Okay, we'll compile and execute. So we're going to require at least 35,000. And each of these values are at least 35,000. Okay, so now we've got a minimum wage that we're comfortable with, but what we're actually wanting to output is the major. So I'm going to replace outputting the wage by outputting the major. Let's compile and execute. So 35,000. Here is a list of majors that have an average wage of at least 35,000. And we could run that again for 32,000. And that opens up our possibilities. We could run this again for 40,000. Starts narrowing our options there. Okay, that's good. What else do we need? We also need to add the criteria of an acceptable unemployment rate. And we'll store that in a variable, which we're going to declare. We're going to declare that variable as the user unemployment and initialize. I'm going to copy that, and we've asked the user acceptable unemployment rate, and we need to store whatever the user types in under user employee. Okay, let's compile. That's how we're doing. The acceptable, we'll say 40,000. Unemployment that's acceptable, 7%. And these are the output of the majors that are just for the acceptable wage, but our unemployment seems to be working fairly well. So let's modify our criteria. And what I'm going to do temporarily is I'm going to comment out our working code, which is the minimum average wage that is acceptable, and we're going to develop the maximum unemployment rate instead. So if the unemployment is less than or equal to what is acceptable, then we will consider that major. Let's compile and test. An acceptable wage, we'll just say 30,000. But let's see, for the what's an acceptable unemployment rate is 7%, and we have the jobs that have unemployment rates less than or equal to 7%. So finally, what we need to do is combine together the minimum wage with the maximum unemployment. And what is that going to look like? It's going to be if this minimum wage and the maximum unemployment rate, then we'll output the major. So we have the minimum wage and maximum unemployment, and if it meets both those criteria, then we'll output the major. Let's take a look at this. So we'll say have to make at least 40,000, and our unemployment rate must be at least 7%. And with those criteria, we only have one option, which is health. Well, what if we were more interested in having a lower unemployment rate than 7%, maybe we'll be willing to sacrifice wage a little bit, but we have to have a better unemployment rate. Let's see, oh, we didn't get any with that one. How about if we do a 30,000 and the acceptable unemployment rate is only 6%? So that narrows it down to health and education. Perhaps we could relax the unemployment rate a little bit, but we'll be more strict on the wage. So I'll relax this to be a 9% unemployment, and there we get a slew of options. Thank you.